Good morning. So my name is Eric Van Vlist. I am an independent consultant and I'm working mostly with XML technology for the last 13 years. My customers are more and more using XForms, and I am more and more involved in XForm projects right now. And I wanted to present today what I think is one of the major weaknesses of XForms, and it happens to be exactly the same that has been mentioned by Nick just a couple of minutes ago. So before we start, I would like to thank the implementers of the 3 XForms implementation I will be mentioning here, Beyond Betterform and XForms, for reviewing my paper and so giving a lot of useful comments. So this is kind of map of my presentation. We are now going through a short introduction, and the next step will be a quiz, kind of test simple examples. And the goal of this is to show you how bad the situation is right now with the lack of components. And I will be introducing a very simple example, so it can also be used as an introduction for XForms for those of you who don't know XForms at all. Then we will take a step backward and we will go back into some slide about theory of the MVC pattern. And then most of my presentation will be dedicated to looking at possible solutions if you really need to define components in XForms. And these ones are classical, and this one will be the solution relying on vendor-specific extension. And we will end up with a short conclusion. I will be showing a lot of angle brackets in the presentation, and I won't have enough time to go into the details of all the elements and attributes there. I still think it's useful because it can give you, by just looking at the number of elements and attributes, the size of the snippet can give you a rough idea of the complexity which is involved. And of course I will insist on the more important elements and attributes, the ones which are useful for this presentation. So first we will I will introduce this very short example, and I will do it in 3 different ways. So the first step here, is just a simple question. Let's say you have this instance, so you have figures, and in these figures element you have a line, only one single line, and you need to edit its length with its, and the length itself is composed of a value. Value that is a pure and digital value, and then the unit. So here I want to say that my line, the length of light is 10 inches, for instance. And the expected result is something like that. I want here a simple input field for the value and a drop-down select for the unit. So something which is very typical. And it's quite simple to do that with XForms. You would be disappointed if it was not, of course. So in XForms you have what we call an MVC design pattern. So we define a model, and this is a model. In the model we define that we have an instance, and this instance is what I have shown in the previous slide, just the XML elements with the figures, line, length, value, and unit. So the model is very simple. This model is very simple. Of course you can create complex models with XForms. And this is the view. This view is composed of a group. Here is what we call controls in XForms. So XForm group, XForm input, so these are XForms control. In the group, I set a context node like I could do in XSLT, for instance. And the context node here is the length within the line element. And I said that I have 2 different controls within this group, an input. So the input is classical input field, and a select one. And select one, which has been already shown by Nick, in that case will be displayed as a drop-down menu. So something very simple. You just see that we can differentiate here in the item the label from the value. It's all very classical. You can do this in HTML. And for this very first simple example, we don't need any controller, because in this exercise we don't even care about saving the data. So we don't need any controller at all. Okay, so far so good. So now the second exercise is, let's do the same thing, but now the length is just located in one single attribute, like we could do that in CSS or SVG. And we concatenate here the value and the unit, something which is very typical for some XML vocabularies. I won't discuss here if it's a good practice or not. The point is, some vocabulary uses this kind of thing. And I want to get the same result, because my end user should not have to worry about how the data is stored in the XML. So I want to get the same result. And yes, it's still possible to do this with XForms. It's not very complicated. The model now becomes slightly more complicated. You have now two different instances. The first one is the one which is my real instance, I could say. I call it main. And the second one is the instance we had on the previous exercise. So it's the same one. And the difference between this one is, in this one the length is an attribute with a concatenated value, and in this one the length is still split between value and unit. So this is my new model. The view is the same than we have, except that now I said that I want to take the length within the split instance. So split is the ID that I've been using in the previous slide. So I have the same view, and now I have something in the controller. So in XForms there is no element called controller, and you could decide to put controller things in the model or in the view. It's very flexible. And most controllers' actions are done using what XForms call action. So this is an action. An action takes place when something happens. So this is, for instance, an action taking place when the XForms is initialized. This is the XForms ready event. And in this action, for instance, I say that I want to set a value. This value is in the split instance, is the value element in the split instance. And the value here, well, I have tried in my example to be portable, so I am using xpax1 expression. The value will be much easier to, this will be much easier to implement using xpax2, but here I'm using xpax1. And one of the ways to do this kind of thing with xpax1 could be to use the translate function here. Okay. So basically the idea is when the XForms is initialized, I put the information, I copy the information from the main instance to the split instance, and when the user is changing the value in the split instance, I put the right information back into the main instance. So it's possible to do this kind of thing with XForms. It may look complicated if you don't know XForms, but when you are a little bit familiar with XForms, it's something that can be done very easily. And now the third exercise. Okay, now I don't want to edit the length of a line, but I want to edit the height of a rectangle and its width. So I want to do the same thing, but I want to do it twice. And the bad thing about that is that the only way to do so with standard XForms is to use copy-paste and to do twice the same thing. And to do so, for instance, just to show you how bad it is, I will need to add now two instances in the model. One to store the split value of the height, and one to store the split value of the width. I will have to define twice the same group of controls. The only difference is that the first time it's making reference to the width instance, and the other time is doing reference to the height instance. And I will have also to copy all the controls twice. So, and again, if you are using plain standard XForms, interoperable XForms, is the only way to do so currently. And now, as an homework, I will let you think about how we would what we would have to do if the rectangle was repeated. And I want.
Sorry, why don't you use the same instance and put the data in two elements inside the same instance? And why do you create two?
It's possible also.
Would
It's
it
not
be
necessarily,
simpler?
yes, it's
Easier?
not, I don't find it simpler, but it's possible. So, yeah. And actually, if you have a repeated rectangle, you would have to use a single instance in your model, because when you when you have repeated content here, obviously you want to give to the user the ability to add new rectangles and to remove new rectangles. So you don't know how many of these instances you would have to. So you will have to put all in one single instance. And then your action would become much more complicated, because you would have to keep the number of elements in the instance in sync with the number of instances. So I won't do the exercise here. It's possible, but it becomes really very tricky. So what? Yeah. The problem is, to summarize it, I think we have a real lack of components to package group of controls together with their models, views, and controllers in XForms. So now, just take a step backward and look at theory. In fact, what XForms is trying to implement is what we call a model view controller. It's a very well-known design pattern, where a user, in fact, sees a view. Views is a view on the model, and the user doesn't really act directly with the view, but he acts on the model through a controller. So this design pattern is, in fact, what we can call a separation of concern. We take a big, difficult problem, and we separate the three different concerns. First one is the model. The second one is view. The view can be given to a designer, web designer. The controller can be given to a developer, and model basically could be given to an architect. So the goal of this design pattern is to separate the concern of one big application. And it's very useful indeed. The thing with the MVC is that it doesn't play very well with modularity, because if you split things into three different domains, it becomes difficult to split the same domain into different components. And this is a very generic problem with the MVC. And over time, people have come with something which is called HMVC, which is hierarchical MVC. This feature is taken from Java. Well, if you Google for hierarchical MVC, HMVC, you will find a lot of references on the web. So it's a very well-known problem. And what we like, in fact, in XForms is exactly something to implement this HMVC. Okay. And components should have their own models, views, and controls. Now let's have a look at possible solutions. The first one we already have seen is to use copy-paste. And I would say that's probably the most common practice with XForms today, because it's the most obvious solution. And even on the data from mailing list, one of the answers has been, well, why don't you copy and paste the same code for the width and height? It's because it's something which is usually done. One of the things that we've seen is that it becomes very tricky to support repeated content. But still, I wanted to mention it as a solution because it's used in the real world with XForms. So the second solution, second kind of solution, is to generate your XForms. So instead of writing your XForm by hand, you generate it, or you use something which can be called a templating approach. In fact, I classify templating as a way to generate XForm. Yeah, this is a 3D printer because it's a modern way of doing generation. So this generation of templating can be seen as a way to automate copy-paste. Because we are XML developers, we all use XSLT. We guess most of us use XSLT. And when we have something complex to generate, one of the obvious way for us to do is to use XSLT. And it's really reasonably easy to do. I will just give an example. So what I would like to do, what I would like to see as a user of this templating model system is a model which is as simple as this model. I don't want to care about how it will be processed. I want to see only my instance, the real instance with the value concatenated here. And the view, ideally, I would like to see something which looks like XForm control. Here they've called it my dimension. It's my dimension component. And I want to be able to give the reference here of the node in the instance which is carrying the value to edit, so it's 8 or width. And I want to be able to give a label like I would give to any XForms control. So this is reasonable from user perspective. And in fact, the good news is that if I want to generate the complete form for these elements, it's quite easy to do with XSLT. And to show that, I will show an example of how it can be done. So, because I have to generate 3 different things, I have to generate the model, view, and the controller. I will be using XSLT, but I will be using a set of modes. So here I am matching the my dimension in the model mode, and I will generate an instance. So I take a variable, because I will need to give a unique ID to the instance. So I put the ID in variable, and I generate the instance, and this is a split instance. So very simple. To generate the view, it's exactly the same mechanism. It's not very complex. I put a variable with the same value of the ID. With this value, I make a reference to the right instance for this ID, and then I have an input and select one, and I give them ID so that I am able to make reference to them through the controller. And then the controller, as I have stated in XForms, you can put the controller in the model, which is what I am doing here. So I am reusing the same model here. And after the instance, I put the actions which are necessary to move data from to the different instances. So again, if you know XSLT, this is straightforward if you know what you want to generate.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure to understand where is the XSLT evaluated. Is it on the server before sending the XForms to the client, or on the client side?
It's wherever you want. It can be statically done because it's it could be done dynamically when you do the HTTP request. It could be statically done, and you could generate the XForms from a static description, or it could be done client-side with XSLT forms. You should be able to.
So you could execute it on the client side, and then
Yes.
only after that the XForms are done.
Yes, it's really. You can choose wherever you want. It's not really important here. Yeah. So the thing is that what I have shown here is easy, but in fact, in reality, it's not really that easy. It's not that easy because of 2 different details, of course, as the web develops in distance. We are not doing anything special with repeated content. So we would have the same problem with repeating content that I have mentioned with the copy path. In fact, if we want to support repeated content, it will become much more complex. Another detail is that I am using the ref attribute on the my dimension element, on my template, in fact. And this ref attribute, in the example I have shown, which was there, the ref attribute, you have the feeling that it's a relative XPath expression. The problem is that in the actions, you don't, in the XForms action, you don't have the notion of a context node, and in that case you cannot use a relative expression. So if you want to do it really well, it's not that easy. It becomes a little bit more complicated. And that's why I think we need something better than just using XSLT. And unfortunately, the only other solution we have, unless you have an idea just right now, but I have not found any for them, are to use XForms specific extension. It's possible, but unfortunately, these extensions are not interoperable. If you design for or beyond, that won't work with XSLT forms. If you design with XForms, it will not work with better forms. So the good news is that then you have a vendor extension to do so. The bad news is that they are not interoperable. So the first one I will present is how you would be doing this with RBeyond. RBeyond forms is one of the XForms implementations. It's probably the one I am using most of the time. They're using something which is called XBL component. XBL is an old W3C specification which is now deprecated. It has been brought by Mozilla to carry on by W3C. And the way they are using the XBL components it's really designed for this kind of use case. Exactly what they wanted to do with XBL components. So we will see that, of course, it's working. The other important thing to note is that there are, I think, 3 different versions of these XBL components. And the one I will be describing here is what they have implemented with version 4 of Beyond. And it's important because it was very difficult at the beginning to know what these components should look like. And it's really, these components are taking into account all the experience they had using XBL. So, what I've called color is the color form. In fact, it's the form for the, it's not really the end user, but people using the component, developers using the component. So you have the same model than, you can have the same model than we have for the templating model here. So you just only define one instance, you don't have to care about how it will be processed by the component. You have the same view than we have for the templating approach here. So you have a my dimension element, you have a reference and a label. The difference is that in the templating approach, you are generating XForms from this element, and now we are making a new instantiation of a component when we see this element. And it makes a lot of difference, we'll see this. So now the XBL, it will be difficult. So and let's go faster. Then the XBL structure is this one. And the component model goes into part of the XBL component, which is called the implementation. So I define the model itself, and I define only the instance in which I am interested. I define the view, like this. And the most interesting thing is in the controller. The controller is pinned between the handler. The handler is for the external events coming from the outside. So here I am putting the action to translate the external instance into the internal one. And in the implementation, I put the internal part of the controller, which is what's happening when a user is changing the value. But basically, it's same. You have to understand the XBL structure, and it's the same logic that I had in the most simple example. So XBL, in very short summary, is really what you need for this kind of use case. Of course, you can be not that happy that they're using XBL, which is an old deprecated specification, but it's really doing the trick. The components, model, views, and controller are encapsulated, and there is absolutely no limitation. Now you have another familiar solution, which are called subforms. And subforms are implemented, but they are implemented differently by better form and XSLT form. And the difference are enough that they are not interoperable. If you run subform or better form, you won't work with XSLT form, and vice versa. The important thing with subform is that they have been designed for modularity and performance, not for the problem we are trying to solve. The problem which is solved by subform is a very, very big form with different sections. And because you don't want to have all the sections loaded in memory at the same time, you introduce a way to load and unload in different sections. So now for better form. So better form, let's see, it's clear. We've just discussed this with John Turner on the better form user managing list. Subform are called subform because they are not XML, they are not components. So we will be misusing a feature, and because of this, we will have a lot of downside. They have announced that the next version of better form will come with a better approach for components, maybe relying on web components. And the thing to know about subform better form is that they're strongly encapsulated. the caller form, the master form, and the subform have their own model, and they don't have they have access. The access between their model is controlled by a set of communication features. The curious thing about subform is that there is no support for ID collision, which means that you have to take care in subform not to use the same ID that you are using in the caller form. And that means so that you cannot load at the same time two instances of the same subform. If they define in IDs, you will have ID collisions. So again, the workaround for this is to load only one subform at a time. And from a user perspective, if you want to do that, we have short demo, I think. You will have to put some buttons so that you control when you load one of the subform. Here I have loaded the subform for the 8. And now I have unloaded the subform for the 8, and I am able to load the subform for the width, and vice versa. It means that the user interface is not the one I wanted to get. It's something different. It can work, but it's kind of workaround, let's say. So the communication between different models, because we need a communication between different models. We need to do this transformation between the concatenated version and the split version. It can be done by 3 different ways. Here we will be using in-memory submission. So now the model of the subform would be this one. I have 2 instances, one which is concatenated, and the other with which is splitted. The view will be the same one that we've seen a number of times now, but working with the split instance. And the controller would be this one. In fact, I am using submission instead, and I have submitted information here into the master model, the model which is calling the subform, and I am using a specific interface, instance, which I call dimension interface to do that, because it was just easier. And when I do an HTTP, sorry, no, not an HTTP post, but when I do a post on this model master instance, I am writing the instance. When I am doing a get, I am reading the instance. Now what becomes really not interesting, but really tricky is the master view, because I won't go into detail, but this is what is needed to do all the logic of displaying the edit button when it's possible to edit the form, to load the form when you click on the edit button, and when you edit one form, you don't display the edit button on the other one, and so on. So it's becoming the complexity that I have gained by avoiding the duplication of these instances is lost by the complexity of this. But again, it's not designed to implement components, and the main complexity comes from the fact that we needed to avoid the ID collisions. Now quickly with XForms. XForms are the same kind of subform, but with very important difference. There is no encapsulation at all in XForms. On the contrary, the model, views, and controller are merged. There is no support for ID collision either. And the context node is available in subform views, which is interesting, but I would need to be able to access to the context node also in the action. It's not possible. And because there is no encapsulation, there is no need for intermodal communication, and the loading is done slightly different. With these differences in mind, it's possible to port what we've done with Dataform to XForms, and it will be included in the proceeding. Now, while we were discussing this on the XForms report mailing list, Alain Couture has come with what I call a gift for XML London. He has implemented a new control which is called XF component, which can be a simple answer to this issue. So this component is an experimental feature, so we don't know it will be there in 2 months' time, but we can hope if it's used. It's similar to subforms, but it's automatically loaded. You don't have to care about loading and unloading components, it's already loaded. There is no support for ID collision either, but it comes with 2 functions, a couple of functions, to get the context node and subform this form instance. And because of this function, we don't need to have 2 different instances in the component itself. We can make reference to the context node. And because we don't need to have two different instances, we don't need to define IDs. And if we don't use IDs, we don't have ID collision. So we can do the trick. I will show it very. So the model again would be this one. The component tool would be this one. You see that we are using here the subform instance to make reference to the current instance. And we are using here the subform context here to have access to the current context node in the color form. And that's where, why we don't need to have two different instances. And the master component will be, this is for the master form. It's very simple, the one we want, in fact. And this is how you would call the component. It will be XF component, reference to the node which has been edited, and we will define the resource here, the name of the location to the subform. Okay, so a very quick summary about XForms is similar but different to letter forms, subforms. There is this new component experimental control which can do the trick with simple cases such as this one. If we had something more complex where we would have to define several instances, we would be in trouble because of ID collision. And now the end. So again, copy paste and generation templating unfortunately are the only interoperable solution if you have really this requirement of using components. The Arbian implementation currently is the only one which is designed specifically to implement components, so it's the only one which really works well. Subforms, you can trick them into implementing components, but with restrictions. You will have to have a different user interface. And the XForms experimental component is promising. Just the last word, don't forget that you can combine these approaches, and you can combine generation with subform. In some cases, it can be very, very useful. And for the future, as Nick mentioned, component subform will not be included in XForms. I hope they come in the later version. But maybe also implementers could agree on something interoperable to fix this issue. Thank you. Sorry for me.
I have one question. So you perform basically a transformation from the original XML to some other form that is manageable by XForms.
Yes.
Why don't you perform that transformation, let's say with XSLT, maybe on the server or with subs on CD? You know, when you transform
Yes,
to a model that can be edited easily with XForms,
in this specific example, yes, in this specific example it will be possible. But if you want to implement more complex components like Nick has shown, I could have taken, for instance, I have recently developed during a training a very simple component to display stars to rate an article. And in that case, we don't have to deal with the instance, but still we want to reuse some code to do so. Yeah. In that case, we need also a way to define components.
You're missing the encapsulation. I mean, so everything is, when you're sending events inside your component, it's going out in the outer form, so maybe other controls may interact with it. Your instance data isn't private, and then for simple things, just another display of one value is, you can easily do that like that, but if you're creating more complex components, then you definitely need something.
But if, for a simple example, the XForm is so complicated, why,
That's a huge download.
I wanted to show a simple example because I wanted to be able to show the end of brackets and screen. But,
Okay, one more question. Hang on there.
Thank you for that, Eric. It wasn't clear to me, I may have missed it, but is the components meant to be dynamically loaded in at runtime? Is that a possibility?
But you mean the way to for the session generation? You mean?
Are you
Yes,
designing these components to be switchable at runtime? Can you load these in at runtime?
The component is subform. Subform is designed to be loaded and unloaded at runtime, so you can control that. The difference with component usually they are loaded also at runtime, but you cannot unload them. They are acting really like XForm components, XForm controls.
you, Eric. Thank you very much, Eric. Cheers.